I am thrilled to have the opportunity to spend some time with John Connolly today in the context of his relatively new book. It's out a couple of months now, Shadow Voices, 300 Years of Irish Genre Fiction, A History of Stories. It's edited by John. I've been delving into the contents and really enjoying what you've done with this, and I'm ill-equipped to commend you in that I feel like I'm in good company because the reviews of it have been excellent, John. And it really seems like you've done a service to anyone who's interested, I guess, in Irish writing in general. And I think some of your provocations in the introduction in terms of how we look at genre fiction, in particular in the Irish case, but more generally, is really, really instructive and of course, so well written. And John, I know you a little bit, but when I saw the list of your publications at the start of Shadow Voices, you've written so much. First of all, congratulations on this. Thank you. Tell us a little bit. You get a lovely sense of this from the introduction, and to, if I correct me now if I'm making any inaccuracies, John, it's a collection, it's of short stories. You've decided not to, for example, pull out excerpts of novels, which to me sounds prudent, but it will explain as well some of the choices you're making. It's done chronologically, right? You're starting with the earliest pieces from Swift up to almost the present. I suppose, and you're mixing names we know well, the Yeatses and the Joyces, etc., with then names that may not be on the tip of everybody's tongue. Would you do me a favor, John, and contextualize where this edited collection came from, and why you were motivated to put pen to paper in this way, a different type of kind of collecting information and presenting information that you do?
Yeah, well, the first is that one of the reasons why I called it A History in Stories was that I didn't just want to put together an anthology of stories. I don't like those. It's a very easy thing to do, to just slap together 50 or 60 or 100 stories without any context. So the book is about 450,000 words long, but 100 original content. It is introductions, it's essays, and it tries to make connections with all of these writers, because quite frequently when we look at a genre collection, someone will put together, great Irish detective stories, great Irish tales of horror. But that's putting the cart before the horse a little bit, because for a lot of these writers, somebody like L.T. Mead, who may not be very familiar to a lot of readers, who essentially, you don't have Enid Blyton and J.K. Rowling without L.T. Mead. L.T. Mead was the person who began writing what we now think of as the girls' school story, where these stories set in boarding schools where the new girl comes in and there's all of these kind of difficulties. But at the same time, she was writing medical mysteries and tales of detection and horror stories and romances. And she was also editing a groundbreaking magazine for young women, which promoted education for them. So she's not just the writer of girls' school stories. She's not just a detective writer. But most readers are not going to have that information at their fingertips, So each story comes with quite a long general introduction about the writer and their lives, because sometimes I think that you can learn a story assumes a different context. You need to know something about the life of the writer. Take somebody like C.S. Lewis. We forget C.S. Lewis, who created the Narnia books, was Irish and was very proud of his Irishness. And as I argue in the book, only an Irishman would have destroyed Narnia at the end, this English idol, But the story in it is quite an odd piece of science fiction that Lewis wrote. And it begins to make more sense when you learn just how odd Lewis's private life was. He appeared to have had a very difficult affair with a much older woman, the mother of one of his comrades in arms. That was very difficult and very fraught. And knowing that, the story assumes a different context. The reader can read it in a very different way. And I quite like that. I like providing information. But I suppose the genesis of the book was, many years ago, I was nominated for a prize at the Listowel Writers' Festival. This is what one of the things I won't do is go to literary prize giving ceremonies. There are many things I'd rather gnaw my foot off, than eat chicken in a basket for half an hour, at 5-1 odds against. And I drove down, and before the award ceremony, they decided to feed us because, didn't want people collapsing, fainting, because thinking, when is this thing going to end? And I ended up sitting, because I happened to be sitting beside one of the judges. And he had a big plate of bacon and cabbage in front of him, which he was wolfing down. And he looked at me and he paused with a forkful of bacon just at the tip of his tongue. And he looked at me and he said, he said, "You're right very well." He said, "Have you ever considered applying your talents to something more appropriate?" And I realized that, I probably needn't have rushed down to the prize giving ceremony. I could probably have taken my time and missed nothing. And that always took me, not apart from the fact that it was such a crass thing to say, but maybe, what did he mean by appropriate? Appropriate for an Irish writer, perhaps? That somehow the implication was that writing genre fiction wasn't really an appropriate pursuit. And while there have always been difficulties and snobbery surrounding genre fiction, they seem particularly persistent in Ireland. And I wondered why that was, particularly because up until the start of the 20th century, we dominate genre fiction. We're dominating women's literature, we're dominating romantic fiction, we're dominating horror, we're writing groundbreaking detective fiction. And when I began writing in the 1990s, there were almost no models for what I wanted to do. Genre fiction had almost ceased production at that stage. And certainly up until about the time of Maeve Binchy. There really isn't a great deal of genre fiction being produced. And there are very specific cultural and historical reasons why that happened in Ireland.
And John,
and restore genre fiction to the canon in a way.
So essentially, what you're kind of presenting there and in the introduction is that that position of genre fiction is essentially a 20th century kind of convention, right? And would I be correct in thinking? I don't know whether you do kind of imply it. I don't know whether it sounds like kind of Victorian sensibilities are colliding then with, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the ideals of what Irish nation state building is supposed to mean. And is that where
I think that's one of the things that happens. Absolutely. I think when we begin moving towards making the preparations for independence, I suppose, one of those preparations is cultural. And so you have people like Douglas Hyde and Yeats looking at cultural aspects of Irishm that are particularly Irish. So the Irish language, mythology, things that are not English. And Douglas Hyde makes a very famous speech to the Dublin Literary Society in which he says, we need to turn our backs from shilling shockers and penny dreadfuls. They were English. They were other. They were not Irish. So right at the end of the 19th century, we begin to see this assault in Ireland on the idea of genre fiction, of what is, to go back to that word, what is appropriate for Irish writers to write. And so, and then after, after independence, when we begin to decide what kind of nation we want to be, literature has a part to play in that as well, but it's primarily Catholic and rural. For some people like Daniel Corkery, it should rhyme and it should be in the Irish language. There are these prescriptions about it. And at the same time, you have the birth of modernism. Yeah. And, modernism distrusts populism. This doesn't like plots. It actually doesn't care very much for literature and art by women. And all of these things are very much to do with genre. Genre fiction is popular literature. Genre fiction prizes plots. And genre fiction, like a lot of fiction, is written by and for women. And so I think genre fiction in Ireland finds itself under assault from two different sides. And I think it could have survived one or the other. But it really struggles when it's under assault in both directions. And actually, some people do keep writing genre fiction, but they mainly do it from abroad. They go away and they don't write fiction set in genre fiction set in Ireland. They set it in England or they set it in America. Very few of them stay in Ireland to continue writing.
So can I ask you, John, I don't think I've ever asked you before, in that context, when you started writing, and I think I know the answer to some of this, in that I know that you had kind of come from a journalistic background. But in a context where the pressure would have been so great to not write genre fiction, which is what you've done over your very successful career, what are the why did you not go down that route, I guess?
I felt that I've actually been writing about this. I've been kind of doing some academic work on it along as a result of Shadow Voices. And I remember thinking back to my time in school. And I went to an inner city school in Dublin. I came from quite a working class background. And so I went to Christian Brothers School, Sing Street. And a man named Francis McManus, an Irish writer, had taught at Sing Street at one point. And perhaps for that reason, although he was on the intermediate certificate syllabus as well, it was decided that Men Withering, his novel about the third final British poet, I think in the 17th or 18th century, would be appropriate to give to 13 and 14-year-old boys from inner city Dublin as an example of the best of Irish literature. And the experience of reading Men Withering was so appalling to me that I was a kid who you could not stop me reading books. You know, I actually ceased reading for about 3 months as a consequence of being forced to read Men Withering. And I wondered what that did to perhaps young men in my class who perhaps didn't think reading was much cop to begin with and couldn't understand why somebody would spend their time doing it. And I think that always stuck with me. That's kind of oppressive feeling of what Irish literature should be, which was nothing to do with my life, did not speak to me on any level. And I think I carried that with me. And all I wanted to do was escape when I began writing. And I think, we forget, obviously, and a lot of the people who are familiar with the work of NYU, and Irish people in general will be familiar with the concept that Irish people went to America and went to Britain to get away from things. They felt they were forced. They maybe felt they didn't have any other choice, but it was the opportunity to create something new from their lives. But you can also escape culture. You can choose to divest yourself of some of that baggage and expectation and explore a different literary form, never necessarily leaving your shores. And that was what I wanted to do. But it's only over the last decade or so, and Shadow Voices probably helped to concretize this, that I realized I brought an awful lot of the things that I thought were a burden with me. And they are the things that make my writing distinctive. Because it would be I share an agent with Lee Child, and Lee absolutely does his own thing. But Lee, I think, looked at American fiction, and particularly American genre fiction, crime fiction, in a very hard-headed commercial way and thought, I can use this form, I can take it, I can write a very good imitation of an American crime novel. I can take all of these conventions and I can use them and be very successful with them. And I don't write books like that, because I brought with me a very Irish Gothic sensibility. Because probably the only part of Irish literature that did resonate with me was supernatural fiction. I'd read all of Stoker, for example. I loved horror stories. I loved ghost stories. And it's often been said, I know Jarlath Killeen has written about this, that there's a very particular Gothic sensibility to the Irish. It's not like American Southern Gothic. It's its own thing. And the books I wrote from the beginning were absolutely infused with that Gothic sensibility, that Irish Gothic sensibility, and that willingness to put the rational and anti-rational side by side, which is a very Irish thing. That you can't be Catholic and entirely rational. So all of these things fed into the literature that they were doing, and they were an aspect of my Irishness. And when I was putting together Shadow Voices, one of the things that struck me was, I'm just part of a continuum. And, going back to Sheridan Le Fanu, when Le Fanu writes the introduction to Uncle Silas, you can see him wrestling with this, because he realizes that the critics are going to come after him because he's not writing straightforward crime fiction. He's not writing a straightforward sensationalist novel. He's using some of the language of the supernatural in it, and he's using some of the conventions of Gothic literature. And he tries to preempt his critics in it. He says, he turns to Walter Scott and he says, well, if it was good enough for Walter Scott, it was good enough for me. And when I was reading Le Fanu's introduction to Uncle Silas, it was almost like, in a way, it is perhaps in a very different idiom, I was seeing my own defenses of what I was doing being written down a century. And Shadow Voice taught me that actually this tension has been ongoing. It's been ongoing in genre fiction in general, but in my type of writing, it's been ongoing since the beginning. And actually, I felt better for that at the end of it. I felt like when I started publishing, I felt a bit like I was alone. There weren't that many crime writers working in Ireland. There wasn't that much genre literature being published. There certainly weren't very many people trying to mix elements of the supernatural with the crime novel. And so going back and again and again in Shadow Voices, reading somebody like Charlotte Riddell, I can see somebody trying to do what I was doing, wrestling with these same problems. And I managed, doing Shadow Voices, I managed to locate myself better in the continuum of Irish writing than I had before.
Yeah, that's really,
and that was lovely. And I there was a comfort with finishing it. It was worth doing for that alone.
That's really fascinating, John, to kind of, it speaks as well to, I suppose, the experience that you've amassed and the point you are in your career, that you have that kind of, you can, that's not something you can do kind of as a new writer. I think you have to.
Oh, no, I think so. And also there's something nice on a personal level. I publish a book. I'm about to publish my 35th book in 23 years. So I write very slowly, but I write every day. But you can feel as a writer sometimes that you're on a little hamster wheel, and that all you're doing is focusing on your next novel, and then and so it's quite nice to step away from that and write something that is, okay, it was personal to me, but it wasn't about me.
Yeah.
And it was about, I really felt very strongly about wanting to restore these writers, particularly these female writers, to the position they deserved in the canon of Irish literature.
Do you think, John, I mean, what have reactions been to, say, from people for whom, or do you pay attention to do you pay much attention to kind of reviews or to reactions, and to Shadow Voices in particular? Have there been good and bad reactions to it that kind of matter?
I think the reviews, I generally, for my own novels, I try not to read them because they don't do you any good at all. The reviews for Shadow Voices, as with He, when it's something very different, I'm often curious to see how people say it. I mean, Shadow Voice in particular, one of the problems I think is that it's so long that it put off some reviewers. It came out because it requires a bit of time and effort to invest in it, to actually follow the arguments through. Because as you pointed out very perceptively at the beginning, it puts its stories chronologically and its writers chronologically. And I felt that was very important, because if you don't do that, and if you don't give readers proper introductions, you don't get to see those conversations taking place between writers, sometimes contemporaries, centuries. And I very much wanted to give people that opportunity. And I think the reviews have kind of picked up on that it is a slightly different way of looking at Irish literature and putting together an anthology. I suppose the only criticism that rankled slightly was that there was one in an otherwise lovely review in the Irish Times, wondering why there were perhaps not more, it's a very white volume. And unfortunately, that's kind of unavoidable, actually, because for so much of our history, we were a very white nation. And even coming up to the present day, a couple of writers were suggested as possible inclusions, but again, it's not a book that touches on children's literature. There would be a volume in itself. If I was to put in children's literature, it would have been 2,000 pages long, and I had an absolute limit of 1,100 pages. And also some of them were very recent arrivals into the country. Now they will transform our literature, and that's wonderful. And what I hope is that this Shadow Voices is not the final word on anything. It's part of a new and ongoing conversation about Irish writing. I'm part of it with people like Swan River Press, who've been doing these beautiful reissues of neglected Irish writers of supernatural fiction. It's part of what Jack Fennell has been doing with Tramp Press, of picking these writers, an awful lot in the Irish language, and translating them and saying, look, Irish writers have written science fiction, we've written fantasy literature. And part of what's being done in places like TCD and UCD, where there's been a concentration on Gothic literature, there are these new publications, there are new younger academics who don't have any of these hang-ups about genre literature at all. So it's part of that. And what I hope is that maybe in 10 years' time, someone will produce a volume of current Irish genre writing, and it will feature voices from Africa, and it will feature voices from China, who perhaps had a bit of time to bed into Irish culture, and you will have these interesting hybrids that come out as a result. But Shadow Voices were not going to be the place to do that. And actually, I felt I'd taken on one battle, which was enough, which was actually to restore women to the canon. Yeah. Now, and that's really what I was trying to do. It comes back again and again to the way that, particularly after 1916, we neglected women's writing. You know, the narrative of the Irish Revolution and Irish literature afterwards is very male driven. You know, and so sometimes you look at that, well, I could start fighting on so many fronts, but you kind of fight to think, well, I'm going to concentrate my efforts on this. Let's get this sorted to begin with. Then we can start looking at the other things, because as I said, this is just a step in an ongoing process.
So, yeah, no, it's funny. I had read the Irish Times review, but I obviously hadn't read it carefully enough. I thought of that myself. I said the next volume of Shadow Voices will reflect that diversity. I completely...
Yeah, but it will. I think, like I said, I think it will take maybe 5 or 10 years for those people to come into it and, you know, begin to absorb elements of our culture and combine them with their own backgrounds to create these very interesting forms. And it will probably be the work for a younger writer. You know, I think it would be work for somebody who is perhaps working at the same time, for whom these writers are going to be their contemporaries. I think I was rescuing the dead, and somebody else can take on the task of looking after the living.
And also, John, you limited, if I'm not mistaken, to those born in Ireland. I think if you were, you know, maybe looking at a generation or two out, that would actually broaden your pool to...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But it would have, again, it was the same reason why novels were excluded. It would just have made the whole thing absolutely, you know, it would have gone out of control. And literally we had, our printers could only bind 1,100 pages.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No, I'm saying that as an observation.
Oh, no, I absolutely understand. Yeah.
And but also, no, I had a point on that I wanted to follow up on. So that would kind of, any like kind of other diversity that might be there would have been limited to, you know, phenotypic.
Yeah, and you don't want to be tokenistic. You can't just, you know, throw someone in at the end and say, look, you're going to represent everybody. That's not going to work. It is very much the work of another volume. It is
a
volume on contemporary Irish writing.
And what you're doing, John, though, is, and that kind of work would be, it's restorative, is what you're doing in terms of like restoring, in particular, the women's voices, and just kind of, you know, presenting. I think I really, like, honestly, John, the introduction to this volume alone, I think, is really instructive for, you know, students of Irish literature to kind of see I think you lay out very well, if I can say, you wear your historian's hat very well in terms of like what's going on over, you know, right into the 19th century and earlier. And that kind of takes me to my next question, like, so how many, sorry, I didn't have a chance to count, how many entries are in, John? How many of them?
I think it's 70 something, I think.
So how difficult was the process of, you have those parameters, born in Ireland, short story, etc. Like, how difficult was the process of what to leave in and what to leave out, or which pieces of genre fiction to choose?
Yeah, it was very hard. You know, afterwards someone said, well, should Fionn OBrien not have been in there? And you go, well, actually, yeah, he did write a couple of genre stories. Is he a genre writer? You know, I would rather, if we're going to have that argument, I'd rather have put in a story by Yeats, which there's a very short ghost story, like short humorous ghost story by Yeats, who had a very serious engagement with genre fiction, who had published Lord Dunsany, you know, who actually really was fascinated by it. Or to look at Joyce and to put in one of the stories from Dubliners as an example of somebody using genre fiction in a different way. So O'Brien gets mentioned. Really, some of them are personal tastes. There were writers in there who used to work, you know, I put them in, and yet perhaps on a personal level, they don't resonate with me. Dorothy McArdle, I don't like political propaganda. I'm the least Republican person I know. So, that felt like reading the whole volume of her short stories to pick out one felt like, and I was being indoctrinated. I felt like I'd been locked in a room with her. And a light was being shone on my eyes. I don't particularly like the Patrick Pearse story, but I feel it was important to put it in there. And then I had people offering me suggestions as well, because I know the limits of my ignorance, I suppose. So people like Brian Showers or Ian Ross, who had taught me in Trinity, Ian Ross was the one who said, well, you need to look again at Maria Edgeworth, and so, and when somebody says it to you, your heart sinks a little bit, because to get one short story, you have to read so many. Yeah. Some of them fit themselves. I love Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. I mean, I reread all the Stoker short stories for it. But even as I was reading it, I think I'm going to put in Dracula's Guest anyway, because Dracula's Guest has this, even as a child, I remember reading this extraordinary image of the guy, he comes across a marble tomb that has had a stake put through it. It makes absolutely no sense at all. There's this huge stake running, but it's such an arresting image. And this chance to revisit Dracula, to revisit this character, probably the most famous piece of genre literature ever written, created by an Irish person. So some of them were very easy selections. And then some of them were quite, there was a woman, now I have my volume in front of me, because some of them were quite obscure ones. Mary Frances Mchugh, who I'd never heard of at all. And Wikipedia entry at this stage in your existence, you're probably pretty obscure. And she came up because I was reading an Imo Duffy story, and she happened to be in the same volume. And actually her story was far superior to the other one. So there were happy accidents along the way, but then even finding something like that then requires going into the National Library and delving into who she may be.
Yeah, John, that's what I wanted to ask you, like as a historian myself who spends a lot of time like looking at biographies and stuff like that. I mean, I know some of them would have been difficult in that there's so much written about them. You're kind of distilling down what's relevant to the story in question, but others must have been, as this woman you've just mentioned, kind of, where do you even start? So you had to do a lot of biographial research.
And that was quite difficult, because the book was written during lockdown. I pretty much started it almost as a lockdown project, because I had suggested it before, I think early in 2019. And then lockdown happened, and suddenly your access to the books becomes quite difficult, especially not so much primary text. You can find a lot of, thanks so much of it's been digitized or made available. But critical text, biographical text become very easy. So what you end up doing is often compiling notes for when the libraries might reopen. Mm-hmm. And then, when the National Library reopens, you have to book a week in advance, and and have your books orders, they'd be ready and waiting for you. You have these narrow windows that you have to take advantage of. And so it became very, very time consuming and frustrating and difficult. But at the same time, there's a little part of me that's always been a frustrated academic. And it was quite nice to return to something that wasn't really writing fiction, that was writing something very, very different. And as I said to you earlier, as it went on, recontextualizing myself, both as a writer and as an Irish person. And as my other half Jenny said to me, it was an awful lot of trouble to go to make a point.
Now, John, for a big book, will you hold it up for me? Because I'm waiting on my hard copy.
Oh, sure. It is. It's there. It is. It's a hefty. It's a table. It's a step. It performs a multitude of functions. It's not just a book.
But it's. Am I correct in thinking that it went into some kind of reprint or second run?
Like it did. We were quite surprised. I mean, it was never going to be. If this was not going to be, I came. The agreement I reached with my publishers were very good about publishing it, but. They were never. It was never going to have a huge amount of heft behind it. It was just. I thought I hoped there would be enough people who might be interested, not just in Irish genre fiction, because it takes Irish genre fiction as a starting point, because we were so pioneering. If you want to talk about how horror develops, how the Gothic develops, even how science fiction develops, how romantic fiction develops, Irish writers have a part to play in that. So it was a chance often to explain, well, what do we mean when we talk about Gothic literature? What do we mean when we talk about science fiction? Where does that term come from? So it often uses Irish writers as a starting point to discuss, genre fiction in general, or to discuss aspects of it that people might not be familiar with.
And in that way, John, the historical accident or situation of Ireland becoming an English speaking country at a certain point would have, notwithstanding your point as well of, translating from Irish, but that's going to be limited to, today a certain, audience if it remains in the Irish language. But that kind of confluence of English becoming the dominant language in Ireland and our diasporic kind of patterns, and I suppose, how writing and fiction, it's fascinating in your introduction how you plot out, the mechanics of how novels are published even in the 19th century, in terms of whether the three volumes that, like, the first one or two will pick up for, the cost, and how those decisions are being made, or how, we're in the season where everything is all Ulysses at the moment. When it was first published, right, it's published in magazine in a serial kind of format. All those kind of logistical or contextual considerations that you bring together so nicely in that introduction.
Well, I think, and you're trying to deal with some of the misconceptions perhaps that readers and certain critics have about fiction. That the idea of a piece of literary fiction being superior to a piece of genre fiction is a very 20th century idea. It's quite recent. What we forget is that for much of its history, the novel was regarded as the poor relation of literature in general. It was below drama and poetry. And it was very, learned people were very suspicious of it. And they were suspicious of it because you didn't have to be learned to enjoy fiction. You just had to be literate. So they weren't sure about something that couldn't be controlled in that way. They weren't sure about something that was designed often for entertainment. That writers were quite happy to entertain and to explore the possibilities of entertaining. And also fiction as well. There's a piece about I think it was Charlotte Bronte, who was engaged in correspondence with Robert Southey, the poet laureate. And Southey basically told her, women shouldn't be writing fiction anyway. That's not something women should do. And by implication, women probably shouldn't be reading it either. And Charlotte Bronte writes quite an aggrieved letter back to him. An aggrieved letter also filled with sarcasm, God bless her, about this. So and it's really only in the 20, the idea of saying to a 19th century reader, as I say in the introduction, that you would dismiss a piece of genre fiction or judge a piece of fiction to be inferior because it had genre elements would have seemed ridiculous to most 19th century readers. As I say in the introduction, it would be like, relegating Macbeth and Hamlet to second division Shakespeare because they have a ghost in it. That was, so that kind of nonsense. But you bring up the Irish language, and that's a really interesting thing, because one of the writers in the book is Cathal O'Sonder. Cathal O'Sonder is the most prolific Irish novel writer. Nobody wrote as much genre fiction as he did. He wrote science fiction, he wrote westerns, he wrote pirate stories, he wrote detective stories. And he wrote them in Irish. And what he realized was that if you want to keep the Irish language vital, if you wanted to proliferate the use, if you want people to speak it and enjoy it, you have to give them fiction they'll enjoy. You have to give young people fiction they might want to read in Irish. There's no point in giving this, just handing them over a peg or a Tulloch and saying that here's Irish literature, now kids, off you go, and I hope you appreciate the language. They're going to appreciate it much more if you write a Western. But the thing is, the authorities wouldn't support him in it. They wouldn't give him a grant. He tried to leave his civil service job and see if can I support myself as a writer? And maybe, the Irish language folk will give me a bit of a grant, a stipend that will enable me to publish this work that is helping the Irish language. And they wouldn't do it because it didn't conform to their idea of what literature in Irish should be. Literature in Irish shouldn't be pirates, it shouldn't be Westerns, it shouldn't be detective stories. So even in the nature of the Irish language, there's this incredibly conservative attitude, this regressive attitude towards genre fiction. And it's why I get quite, because we've come so far beyond that. And in fact, even genre fiction, postmodernism almost does away with those boundaries. Because you have these writers coming in and mixing literary fiction with genre fiction, using aspects of it. You know, Thomas Pynchon writing The Crying of Loch 49, which is essentially a mystery novel that doesn't have an ending. You know, that's why that's who it meets. Or Peter Ackroyd writing Hawksmoor. If these people doing interesting things with it. So even when we talk about a piece of genre fiction now, it's very hard to what exactly do we mean? You know, because Hilary Mantel's trilogy about Thomas Cromwell is genre fiction. It's historical fiction. That is genre. It's also literary fiction. And that's the difficulty when we begin talking about genre fiction. It's often not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it has genre elements to it, but it quite often crosses into other areas and has always done so.
The other issue that you bring up, the other elephant in the room, John, and I think it'd just be interesting to be articulated very well in the introduction, but to mention it here, is the stifling impact, I suppose one could say, of the Troubles in terms of what may have evolved in genre fiction at a certain point in time. I mean, it's a stark reminder of at a particular moment in time when things may have kind of been loosening up in terms of movements in Irish society, the impact that had certainly in the 70s, 80s, and
Sure.
even into the early 90s. Can you speak to that a little bit, John?
Sure. Again, we have a kind of hiatus after the 1920s when we don't have a great deal of crime literature being written, while it continues being produced in Britain and in America. And then the Troubles creates a very particular set of problems because I think it's very hard to write what you might call a common or garden mystery novel when a couple of hours up the road you have people slaughtering each other in what is essentially a religious, social, and political conflict. But also in Ireland, so much crime feeds into or out of terrorism, in that, you know, the terrorists were running drugs, or they were, you know, penalizing drug pushers by making them pay over money. They were certainly importing pornography, prostitution, running protection rackets on the Dublin docks, because, you know, running a terrorist campaign is an expensive business. And it's very hard to do it legally. And so much writing and so much crime feeds into terrorism. And so it becomes very difficult to write a crime novel that doesn't, to some degree, have to touch upon or deal with terrorism. And that's very difficult to do when a situation is ongoing. I remember Brian McGilloway, a very good Irish writer in Northern Ireland, saying, I think it may have been an event at NYU, where he said, you know, if he wanted to write a crime novel in which, for example, the chief of staff of the IRA in Derry was a character in it, he would have pointed out, well, there was only one chief of staff of the IRA in Derry, and he didn't care to be fictionalized in your book one way or the other. And it's very hard to write, you know, 6 feet underground. You know, there was realities. So you find out, so at a time when in Britain you have Ian Rankin and Val McDermid coming up, you have this kind of next generation of writers moving on from that perhaps cozy tradition that had persisted into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in Britain, or in America, you see you've got Cornwell and you get Michael Connolly and George Pelecanos and Laura Littman's emerging. We don't have those people coming out of Ireland. You know, and it's no coincidence, I think, that the great boom in Irish crime fiction has happened in the 20th century. It's happened very much post 1998, and has continued since then. Apart from maybe people like Stuart Neville, still very much avoiding the conflict in Northern Ireland. It's still something that we have found very difficult to work through in crime fiction. I don't think we've quite figured out how to do that yet. And there's an argument whether people want to write about it or whether people want to read about it. And I suspect that may be part of it as well. I'm not sure how many people want to read crime novels set around the Troubles. You know, there's a little part of us that I think would really like to leave all that behind. You know?
Or at least for now, John, you know, that it's too close, you know. That
I think so. I think there's almost that we need another decade to let things settle and to give it a kind of context. And maybe, you know, to let some people die. You know, once some people have gone to meet their maker, I think there's going to be a greater historical freedom in writing about the Troubles than there is at the moment. Yeah. And out of that may emerge a different type of fiction. Perhaps you may have a very different view on this.
No, I agree. But the kind of, unfinished nature and the ongoing kind
Yeah.
of implication. I just turned on the news and it's, the Brexit stuff and it's like it's unfinished business in that way. And it's
Yeah.
really interesting how you bring that in. Like, really, I really commend you on that introduction, John. It really does a really great job in kind of
Thank you.
contextualizing all that. Is there like asking you about your favorite children, is there like a favorite piece? Is there one piece that you absolutely love?
There's one writer that if I did nothing else, I was glad. There was a writer named Mary Helena Fortune, and even when the Oxford Guide to Crime Literature was being written, she was excluded from it because most people didn't seem to realize that she was an Irish writer. In the middle of the 19th century, she's born in Northern Ireland. She follows her father to Canada. He's an engineer. At some point, she goes with him with a child to Australia, but leaves a husband behind in Canada. And it seems like she might have been fleeing a bad marriage. Mm. And she has somehow, although she would only have had the kind of education that would have been given to the average girl at the time, which wouldn't have been very much. She turns out she has a talent for writing. And on her way to Australia, she has applied for a job with an Australian newspaper as an editor. But she probably signed herself M.H. Fortune. And when she arrived at the office, they wouldn't give her the job because they said they didn't employ women. Mm. And something sticks with her. She marries an Irish-Australian policeman named Percy Rollo Brett, and that marriage did probably bigamously on both sides. And that marriage doesn't last. But she learns a lot from him. She becomes fascinated by the mechanics of modern policing. And she gets a job writing crime stories, taking over an ongoing series that's already in the Journal in Australia. And she writes them under a pseudonym. And when that series kind of comes to an end, she comes up with her own series. And they are first-person police narratives. I think they may be the first first-person police narrative, certainly the first ever written by a woman. And they're extraordinarily perceptive about what was then modern policing, what was then modern forensics. And she continued. She was so successful at this that it was assumed they were being written by a retired or serving policeman. Mm. And the newspaper, obviously realizing that there was no point in spoiling a good thing, went along with this and didn't tell anybody that they were in fact being written by a young woman from Northern Ireland. And she wrote so many of these stories. She also wrote about Ireland. But she was so successful in her imposture, if you want to put it like that, that when she died, she was buried in another person's grave and nobody knew that she had written these stories.
Wow.
That a bookseller in Melbourne began piecing together, wondering who. She wrote under the name Waif Wander. And he began piecing together this extraordinary narrative of her life. Her son ended up a career criminal, so he probably helped with some of the stories as well. She became an alcoholic. She lost her eyesight. She died in penury. And if Shadow Voices does nothing more than to rescue someone like Mary Helena Fortune from obscurity and say, look, here was an extraordinary woman, Irish female writer who never, ever got her due and is worth remembering, the book would have served its purpose.
Yeah, John, the issue, I know we kind of keep coming back to it, but it's so well articulated in that example you've given of, and something that's personal to me in terms of like some of the work I do as a historian, restoring the narratives of interesting female historical figures and they suffer from, I hadn't quite thought about it in that way until when they use a pseudonym or they're using a different name or whatever, how much more difficult they will be for us to track later on.
Or even, when they were married, because I know that I think there's a writer, an artist that I cover in was Isabel Hawthorne, I think, I can't remember the name exactly, but it's pointed out because she married a couple of times that when she changed her name, it was almost like all the work that she'd done up until that point fell away. Yeah. So even something as simple as having to change your maiden name to perhaps your husband's name, or electing to do that, or under pressure to do that, prevented these women from getting their historical due, because suddenly you have these gaps in the narrative, as you say, that you then have to come back and try and piece together.
So, John, are there any pieces in it that you agonized about putting in? or weren't that really exuberant about putting in?
Like I said, the Pierce piece, the Wailing Woman. I can never. It's a while since I've been chatting about this. So yeah, there's the Pierce short story.
Yeah, I noticed that one.
Yeah, the Keening Woman.
Keening,
I just, again, it's probably that element of it's a little too politically on the nose for me. But I think it's a very interesting piece of Irish crime writing in its way, or a very interesting approach to it. But no, not really. Often, like I said, often stories chose themselves. Some of them came completely out of left field. And then some of them were surprises. I mean, I had to read a lot. I hadn't read Maeve Binchy since college. I'd read Light a Penny Candle because the girl I was going out with at the time insisted that I read it. She said, you know, all you're reading is all these male authors and crime fiction and stuff for your course. And Light a Penny Candle is a fantastic book. Reading, and I had to read an awful lot of Maeve short stories for it. And again, some of them, you could see that some of them she knocked off a little bit. That some of them don't quite have an edge to them, and some of them don't resolve themselves satisfactorily. But an awful lot of them were very, very good indeed. Mm-hmm. And the story in it, Bella and the marriage guidance counselor, is filled with real pain, and I think, you know, because it's very difficult to write simple, clear prose. It seems easy, but it's not, because writing simple, clear prose is about having a huge vocabulary and knowing what to leave out of it. Yeah. And she was very good at using dialogue and simple declarative fiction to communicate to readers. And so, you know, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, in a way. And, you know, as a male writer and a male reader, I think we bring a different set of misconceptions to reading sometimes, and men are less Catholic readers than women with a small c. You know, women are much more fiction by men than men are willing to explore fiction by women. And again, you know, what's worrying is that I think the latest survey showed that 20% of fiction readers are male. Yeah. You know, it's a field that's hugely dominated. It's dominated by women, and you could argue then actually quite probably the better, I'm not saying it's an odd one, but there's probably a better choice of good writing by women than there is for men on the basis of probability on that. And so reading Maeve reminded me that I need to be careful about that. I need to be careful about not falling prey to those assumptions or presumptions about writing.
And when you think of Maeve Binchy, John, it's like it does. I don't know about you, but for me, and you're much better placed to kind of have a sensibility about this, but that Ireland thankfully is gone, in that Maeve was one of the few lights in that kind of field and genre, literally, for a long time. Whereas now, I mean, I find it so gratifying to go into Irish bookstores and see so many books by young female authors in a way that, you know, and
they owe her a debt. I think her debt is not quite acknowledged. As you say they weren't, apart from maybe Ed O'Brien, who had gone abroad but was writing a different type of fiction about Ireland. You know, she not only was she hugely accessible, but she's an Irish female writer writing popular fiction about Ireland and based in Ireland. And she's also the first commercially successful one, somebody who's commercially successful beyond our borders for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. And that transforms, I think, or helps to transform the way British publishers in particular look at Irish writing. Because whatever else you can say about it, for a long time we were often more admired than read. And Irish writers struggled to make a living. And I think the one who really pushes the door open is Marian Keyes. Mm-hmm. But the door is opened, that crucial crack, by Maeve. And after, you know, what happens then is that both Irish and British publishers begin looking at this readership that's essentially created by Marian and Maeve, which is young female readers who want to read contemporary women's literature set in Ireland. And so you have Poole Beg, for example, coming along and maybe not paying them terribly well, but giving them a kind of proving ground. And then often the best of them were then picked up by British publishers. But that's interesting in an Irish context, because suddenly what happens is the readership for popular literature or stroke genre literature in Ireland becomes predominantly female from the off. And it's also conditioned to read writing by women. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why the crime writers who came in the early part of this century, the women benefited more than the men. because there was a readership that had been conditioned to read genre fiction by women.
Right.
And I think they were the beneficiaries of it, because when I began writing, there were an awful lot of male writers, not so many female writers. Now I think there are hardly any male writers who make the bestseller list, certainly writing crime fiction in Ireland. It's completely female dominated. Wow. So that's partly Maeve's work as well. Wow. So thanks, Maeve.
Yeah. She was also a lovely human. When I was in boarding school years ago, she had gone to school with our English teacher, and she came to visit, and she was
lovely, but no fly, didn't take any prisoners.
Yeah.
No, and I think one of the things she did, she was very aware that those Irish writers, female writers coming in, would find themselves under attack by a predominantly male literary establishment. And she made them, she ensured that they socialized together. They would often come to her house and she would host dinners or drinks for them, because she thought, well, wait a minute, if you're going to be attacked from the outside, I don't want you fighting with each other. Mm-hmm. Dealing with these people who don't like you. So she was very careful with that. She knew what they would come up against. You know, she'd fought the feminist war. She'd been there. You know, and she traveled. You know, she'd worked in Israel. You know, she had a wider outlook. Mm-hmm. You know, she wasn't simply a product of this island. She had seen other things. She'd worked in London as a journalist. She came back. She was a very shrewd woman.
Well, John, it's a fitting place for us to conclude, given really, you know, it's not the only thing you do, but the restorative work you do in Shadow Voices in terms of amplifying examples of female genre literature in the short story form. Well done again.
Thank you.
The book is available now in the United States, John?
It is. It's being distributed by Hodder and Stoughton in the United States. So you can either go onto the big A and get it, or your local bookstore should be able to order it for you. And it's available as an ebook, which might make it easier to carry.
Well, yeah, no, but you know what? It's a great, like, I'd imagine, John, it's a great book to have on your shelf in terms of something you'd pick up and put down, right?
Yeah, I think, and it's deliberately designed to look like a kind of old volume. It draws on those old music hall posters. We wanted it to look like something you'd like to have on your shelf with your reference books.
Yeah, and just that kind of twofer that you get with it in terms of the example of the story, but also then the biographical context. I think it's a wonderful reference book, as well as for those who are, well, some will be more and less familiar. It sounds like you've dug up, you know, you've uncovered these voices that very few people will perhaps have known of their work or their profile as someone with an Irish connection. So the full title is Shadow Voices, 300 Years of Irish Genre Fiction, A History of Stories, is edited by John Connolly. It's my pleasure, John, and thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks to you and everyone. You've always been very supportive, so thank you so much.
Oh, it's more than our pleasure to do that, and we look forward to your 36th book. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Thank you.